Modi acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this land. Welcome to the Modi Playbook. If you've ever felt like your systems are technically in place, but somehow still feel chaotic behind the scenes, you're in the right spot. This is where we share what we're seeing, what's working, what's not, and the lessons businesses learn the hard way. Think of it as practical strategy straight from the trenches. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Moti Playbook, listeners. Thanks for coming back for another episode. It's one shift, one system, one measurable improvement. So I'm Kate, and today I am joined by Benny, who is another one of our senior implementation leads here at Moti. We both are here. So we spend our days helping teams turn plans into action. We talk to clients day in, day out. We're in implementations up to our eyeballs. And sometimes we've got some really good insights and information that we can draw out of that and share with you, our wonderful listeners. So on today's episode, we're going to be having a conversation about something that doesn't get talked about often enough, in our opinion, which is why implementations can sometimes fail, why rollouts fail, why systems fail, and why it's almost never the software that's at fault here. So handing over to you, Benny, when you think about why implementations fail and why CRMs don't get off the ground, what's the first thing that springs to your mind?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Really nice to be on this call. Interesting topic. I know we spent some time prepping for this one, so lots of interesting ideas. I think the first thing to sort of point out, like today's podcast, we're going to talk mainly around CRM, right? That's what we do. We do a lot of here, but I'm sure everyone listening to this at some point in their career have been through a software implementation of some sort, and it's been challenging, whether it's, poor communication, it hasn't rolled out well, the team hasn't used it. And you could be on the receiving end of this implementation, or you could be somebody who's leading that. But this is something, I see all the time, and we see examples. We'll talk about examples that happen in CRM and our experience. But I know just like, talking at family gatherings, for example, people find out that I, work in software implementation, and they feel like they can just dump out all the ideas of where things have gone wrong and why it's difficult. So it's a really important topic, and something that, like you said, isn't really thought about a lot, like in ways that we can improve how implementations go, and, ensuring that teams do take on those new systems. Yeah, it's a really interesting piece, but yeah, we'll be talking about CRMs on this one, but I'm sure everyone will have in the back of the mind that one software implementation that didn't quite go so well.
The first thing that springs to mind, Benny, when I think about software implementations that didn't roll out well is, the emails that you get directly after the go live date from frustrated users who say, I don't know where this button is, or you haven't put in all of these options that I wanted and nobody asked me for my opinion. And, you think about all of those times where users are just not up to speed with what's happening, or they don't have the right training in place, or they haven't been consulted on their role and what they do day to day, and it hasn't been considered or configured in the system. And then you get people who are frustrated, who are upset, and who cannot use the system in the way that they intend. That's the first thing I think of, to be honest. So when we're talking about this, I think there's certainly a lot of insight that we can gain into what happens when we don't talk to people, when we don't bring them on board, and we don't consider what the impact of what we're doing has on people's day-to-day lives, because that can be really frustrating. There's a lot of wins that can be gained too, when we're thinking about new platforms that have fancy new interfaces and cool new reports, it's really good, right?
Yeah.
But when we're thinking about users who are not brought along for that ride and who are frustrated and sort of feel like they've been left behind, we really need to take a lot of care that doesn't happen.
Yeah, 100%.
So all of our data then becomes disparate. It's stored in different places and people are using different systems. And then if one of those people leaves a business or moves on to another role, what happens then? What happens with that data? How is that shared, and how is that, kept out of people's inboxes and kept out of people's desktops and shared with the rest of the business?
Yeah. A perfect example of that just recently, actually, where we had a client, they've onboarded and 95% of the team were using the systems really, really well. There was somebody who found it challenging, and instead of, voicing those challenges or trying to, find out how they could use the system better, they just reverted to their old spreadsheets and all the data was there. And it was only once that the leadership team started looking into reporting and there was these huge gaps there that we identified that. Yep. So that was, thankfully we caught that relatively early, that we could bring that information into the system, and work with that person to improve how they're using the tool. But yeah, I can only imagine how often you don't come across that, and all of a sudden it's all, months and months of work missing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads into the concept that change management needs to be an integral part of implementing a CRM platform. There's a big piece, I should say, in collecting the data, in understanding the workflows, in understanding how we want to set up the data and segment the data and put things into a new system and put fields in and all that sort of a thing. But we also need to change manage the people who have to then pick up that system, adopt to it, and start using it day in, day out. So to do that, we need to understand, how are people using their current systems day to day? What works well for them? What doesn't work well for them? Is there an internal champion who is ready to adopt this new system and then help to roll it out to the rest of the teams? And do they have the authority to hold people accountable to using that new system? Are they in a position where people trust them and will listen to them and take their guidance on how that should be done? And what happens to the old way of doing things? What happens to the old spreadsheets? Where do they go? If they're not being used anymore, do they get tossed in the bin? Do we archive those? Do we keep them for historical reference purposes? What does the off-ramp look like from, the system that the company or the business was using to the new system and the new processes?
Yeah, that's such a good point too, how to transition from one to another. And this could be from if we're in CRM world, and look, this is an issue I think we've both seen across different platforms throughout our experience. But if we're, talking about the CRM world, is that, moving from another CRM to Pipedrive or, something similar, or is it moving from spreadsheets and emails into your CRM for the first time? And what does that transition look like? And unfortunately, one of the things that, we see, and I know we talked about this earlier, some businesses think about that transition once the system's set up. So it's kind of like, hey, we've got this thing, we want everyone using it. You've had your training, let's just start using it. Where sometimes you kind of need to flip that a little bit and think about that path from the old system to the new very, very, very early on, so that, systems can be put in place and language and training can be centered around, okay, how are we moving from this way of doing things into the new way? And this is very much, a conversation that is really valuable to have with leaders in those businesses, to understand that if their expectation is we get this new tool, we train the team's just going to use it, you're setting yourself up for failure there, I think, more often than not. And so, just really, understanding how, as a leader in your business, how you're, leading and managing that change management is so important.
Yeah, some great points there. I think about a company that I went and did some work with quite some time back, and they had somebody in an administration role who'd been there for 25 years, and they were an absolute master at their craft. They could run administration processes backwards, frontwards, sideways with their eyes shut, having a cup of tea. They were an expert at what they did. And then when a new system was brought in and that person was expected to adopt a brand new platform with what felt like minimal training, it was an hour or two's worth of training, and then they were told to just get in there and play around in there and have a go at it. It was really quite confronting for that team member, because they weren't used to change and they weren't used to doing things in a different way. And they'd spent so long, crafting these processes that worked well for them, to be told then we're doing it in a different way now and you just need to adapt, really threw them. So I think it's an important piece that we need to remember, is that when we're implementing these systems, there are real people that sit behind the desk using these systems, and we have to bring those people on the journey, as we're rolling those out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So now that we know what bad looks like, well, not bad, but we know what it's like if we don't manage that change well. Yeah, challenging. That's a good word. If we don't manage that change well, we know what can fall down. What does good look like? So when something rolls out really well and cleanly and easily, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think for me, the first thing that I notice, and this has been across multiple different platforms, is when it's not working well, you hear from the team about what's wrong with the system. So this doesn't work, or why does this do it this way? And it's not positive type questions. It's kind of like, hey, you're making my life more difficult. When it's working well, you hear things like, hey, can we do this as well? Or, hey, what about this? And because they can start seeing the system as a tool to improve what they're doing. And really, especially in the CRM space, that's what we're talking about, right? It's not about bringing a system in to add extra admin or extra steps. It's to streamline processes so that that person can go do the thing that they're good at, which is not playing and clicking buttons in the CRM. If they're a salesperson, it's making sales calls or follow-ups and things like that. So Yeah, for me, that's a clear indicator of that. How about yourself, Kate? What do you see in that space?
I agree with you in that I don't often get a phone call from a team member who I've trained or that I've worked with over implementation to say, just wanted to call and tell you everything was great. We need to read into those messages, which is, when people reach out and say, what else can the system do? Can we expand on that? Can we build a better report? Or can we change this slightly just to enhance that? So I agree that that's the sort of feedback you get when you know things are going well. When I'm thinking about my most successful implementations or projects that I've worked with, what I found is that the team have got an understanding of what we're doing right from day dot. They've been brought in from the beginning, and that's a whole team, not just the leaders of a business or the leaders of a particular department, but the team that sits underneath them that are doing that day-to-day processing understand that there is a change coming. They understand why the change is coming and what it's going to do for the business to improve their outcomes, whether it's individual outcomes, whether it's business outcomes, or whether it's better reporting or visibility. They already understand why we're heading into this change. So it makes the wins a little bit easier because people are already on board with what we're doing and how we're going to go about it at a very high level. And it tends to elicit lots of questions right from the get-go, which helps with making sure that we understand how to build a system to roll out to a team and it's fit for purpose, straight off the bat. And it just needs a little bit of tweaking as opposed to an entire redesign because we've missed the mark completely.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
That's what I tend to see more often is that when more people are involved, perhaps not at a granular level, but at a high level to understand why we're there, already it's 50% of the way closer to success.
Yeah. And look, that sort of sparks just a thought. No, I won't go into details about the client. This is a name and shame sort of event, but a client that I worked with some time ago, and it was just a small sales team that was involved. The implementation itself was very much driven by sales manager. So lots of conversations, great understanding of their processes and things like that. And we conducted our training, and you had some good questions on that training session. So for all intents and purposes, it looked like, a really successful setup, but it became pretty clear quickly that the core of the sales team weren't using the tools the way they should. And it's really, really obvious to see that, you can, from a pipe drive perspective, you look at, a deals progressing or activities being created and marked as complete and things like that. And we could see that wasn't happening. And, speaking to that sales manager, they were concerned they weren't getting the right thing. So, we scheduled some time to talk to the sales team about how they're actually using the system and what their processes look like, not just from within a pipe drive perspective, but their processes. And most of them had gone back to, notepads and taking notes because they just saw it as an extra admin step because they didn't quite see the value in what was in there. So we, really broke down their processes and we had to make a few tweaks. We made a few changes and just sort of talked them through where the value comes from in terms of tracking deals and keeping their information up to date and being able to tag in people in the business to assist. And it wasn't long after that we started seeing just some really positive feedback from them because they could understand that it was making their lives easier. They're using the mobile app to track things when they're out on the road and keeping notes against things. And the comment that I remember that we're onto the right path there was one of the sales guys who seemed to be one of the ones who wanted to keep things in notepads more often said, I'm just noticing that things aren't slipping through the cracks, or to that effect.
Yep.
They weren't missing things and, they weren't just focusing on particular deals. So that was really, really good. And, you could see that in the results coming afterwards, looking at reporting and, how things were converting through. So really nice turnaround, but certainly started as a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. And what a small statement to make. I'm noticing that things aren't slipping through the cracks. But when you think about the depth of that statement, that means that the work is flowing correctly. People are confident they can use the system. We can be confident that clients are getting callbacks, sales team members are putting their notes on properly. Everyone's got access to the same information. That's super powerful.
Yeah.
All right. I think why don't you and I go through what our top points are when we're thinking about a CRM adoption. So when we're thinking holistically about a platform that we're putting in place or we're connecting with another platform, when we're thinking about the teams that are going to use it, the leaders who are going to report from it or get business insight from it, let's go through our steps of what makes it stick, what we found to be the most helpful tips. So if you like, I'll start.
Sounds
I think
good.
for me, as I mentioned before, it's defining the why. It's defining the why do we need a change? Why do we need to go to a new platform? what are we solving here? So, teams need to hear this in very, very explicit and plain language. They need to understand where the gaps are, because there may not be gaps in their team and the processes that they do and the way that they do their role, but there might be gaps further up the chain a little bit in visibility on reporting, or, understanding where things are at, or being able to easily see where a deal's at, or where a job's at. So I think if a team cannot answer you, or a single team member can't answer you and say, I understand why we're making this change, you're not really ready to go ahead. I think having that buy-in first and having those people on board with you, ready to adapt to that change, is absolutely critical.
Yep. Yeah, that's super important. I think it's a really good one to kick things off with.
So now, Benny, that we've seen the things that we can do really, really well in implementation and the challenges that we can face, I think it's a good idea to talk about, some steps that you can take as a business or as a business owner to make sure you don't fall down some of those challenging rabbit holes. And Benny, you and I have discussed this offline, and we've gone through and made up a list of 7 different tips that you can take away from this episode today to help make your implementation stick and to help you think about change management and how you're going to roll these things out. So as I said, we've got 7 tips for you. I'll start with the first one. And the first tip, so number 1, is really defining the why. So before you do anything else in terms of picking up a new platform, implementing a new platform, it's bringing your team in really early to tell them why you want to make this change. Individual teams might have challenges that they face, or they might think that their processes are perfect. So bringing people into understanding what the gaps are that you're patching is really, really important. And if you've got team members that don't understand the why, you're probably not ready to start that rollout just yet. You really need to bring them on board.
Yeah, so the second point we've got here is get the team in the room early. And what we mean by this is it's not about bringing everyone in so you've got 50 decision makers in the process, but having the team there available so that we can, as you're rolling out a CRM implementation, you've got an understanding of how the team are going to use the tools. So this could be team across different departments, different functions, and just understanding, what their day-to-day looks like and how the system can support that. Number 2, get the team in the room nice and early.
Nice one. So number 3, identify your internal champion. Modi will be holding your hand through an implementation. We would be giving you information about how the system works and your day-to-day workflows and operations, but that person's not going to be with you forever. They're there for the course of the implementation, and after rollout, they're going to start to step away, as your team begins to adopt that platform. So you need to have someone within the business who is a champion of the system, who can be the go-to person for questions, who can be the system expert, the person who knows where all the settings live, who knows how to configure, your personal preferences, things like that. You want to have someone on hand so that your team members always have someone who's available to them when they've got questions.
Yeah, perfect. And number 4, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but map the off-ramp from the old way. So having a plan in place really early on, how you're going to transition from the way that you're doing things at the moment versus that new system that you're moving into. So whether that's, we talked about spreadsheets, inboxes, just documents, or, another, a previous system, understanding how you're going to move from one to the next, putting a plan in place. Because one of the things you don't want to see is running those 2 systems parallel for too long. Sometimes there is a need to do that, and that's completely understandable. And that should be all part of this, that sort of plan, because the longer that happens, people are going to default to that original way of doing things. And the new CRM platform is going to become a little bit optional. So for us, point number 4 is mapping the off-ramp from the old way.
Good one. So point number 5, you want to design a system for the people who are using it, not for the owner who has purchased it. Now, this one's a little bit controversial. When you've got a business owner who's invested lots of money into a new CRM platform, into training, into, having someone design that system and map it out for them, they really want to have things the way that they want to have them. But if they're not using the system day to day, they might not fully understand what's needed to drive that system forward and what's needed to set up in that system to have it useful and user-friendly and, look and feel the way that a user wants it to look and feel. So certainly what we want to do is reduce friction between your team members and adopting this new platform. And to do that, you really want to make sure that you're designing it to really tailor and fit in with their day-to-day workflows and processes. So that's number 5, design it for the user, not for the owner.
Cool. Excellent. Number 6, we've got plan the first 90 days, not just your go live. Obviously, go live is such an important, milestone in a CRM implementation. You want to be able to get the system in, we start using it and moving forward. But really, that's not the end of that setup, right? Because, we talked about that training piece early on, and, you have that training at go live and people start using the system and then maybe fall off because there's things they don't know what they're doing. Having a plan in place to understand what does a win look like for your business, at day 30, day 60, day 90, how are you going to know that this has been a successful implementation? Defining who's checking in on that. Are you, working with a consultant or somebody like Modi to review at those stage points? Is there somebody in the team who's really driving this project that can check in and verify that, hey, we are getting value from this? Whatever method I think you decide to use, it's really, really important to have that in place so that you can, really ensure that implementation runs well and you're not having the conversation around why is this not working and people dropping off and stuff like that. So, for us here, point number 6 is plan the first 90 days, not just go live. And over you, Kate, for lucky last number 7.
Number 7, final, but certainly not the least important. They're all as important as each other. Treat your data quality like a habit, not like a project. When we see businesses who adopt a CRM and everyone can be really excited when it first comes on board and they want to capture all this cool data because they're excited that they can capture it. Maybe the previous system didn't have a field for that or it didn't do it in a particular way. And, it's really exciting. And sometimes that drops off after the course of time, and people stop putting things in with as much care and attention as they did in the start. And they start skipping fields and thinking, oh, I can't be bothered, filling in 10 fields here. I'll just fill in 5. I'll come back to it later. And then invariably we forget and we don't come back to it later. We're all guilty of that. But certainly what you want to do when you've got a new platform in place is to make sure that you're putting good quality data in all the time, not some of the time. Don't put it off to one side. Make sure you do it right first time, every time, because that's what's going to preserve the integrity of that system. And that's what's going to mean it can continue to be useful year on year on year because that data history is there and everything's captured beautifully. So can't understate this one or overstate this one enough, is that be responsible for the data that you put in and be accountable for that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, very important one. Lucky last. Okay, so we've got some, really important points there. So we've got our list of 7. And I know for us, that's something that we try to bring into every implementation that we work with, right? So, that's,
Yeah, agreed.
the point of, not necessarily the point of difference, but the attitude that we take in. A lot of people sometimes think that our role is about clicking buttons and creating automations and, doing these things in the system. But really it's getting an understanding of our clients' needs, in the framing of, those 7 points that we talked about so that we can get to that end goal. So, very much for Modi, our goal isn't to get somebody to go live into the system. We want to see them successful for a very, very long time. So it's a little bit different than just, clicking buttons in a system. It's really getting an understanding and I guess using those 7 points, as a bit of a framework on how we can, help our clients get the most out of these sort of tools.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Modi steps in not just from a technical standpoint, but from a connection standpoint and a collaboration standpoint. What we really do is get the troops together, get the people in the one place and talking about the same thing to drive towards the right outcomes. And the technical side almost comes second because that's fairly straightforward and step by step. But gaining these understandings and insights of what we're trying to achieve is critical. And that's what we've got a lot of experience doing, and we step in to help a business get onto the right pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's bringing us close to the end of this podcast. Been a really interesting chat to talk through and to think about in preparing for this. So really enjoyable. One thing we'd like to wrap up on these podcasts, and if you've listened to one before, this may be a little familiar. We want to ask the question, if you're a business leader listening right now and you're recognizing some of this in your team or, seeing some challenges that have happened in the past, or maybe you're planning, an implementation to a new system or tool, doesn't necessarily need to be a CRM. What is one shift in your thinking that you could take away from this? So I'll direct that question to you as well, Kate. So if you had that piece of advice or put yourself in the shoes of a business leader, what is the one shift that you could take away from today's podcast?
Yep. If I think back about the conversation we've just had, there's been so many good points raised about things that you can do really well or things to be wary of and to take heed of. The thing that I want you to take away from this is that you have to shift your mindset. You can't buy a package and pop it into your system or into your tech stack and expect it just to work. it takes people, it takes input, it takes people's opinions, it takes sometimes arguments and sometimes heated discussions about what people think is best and the way that people do their best work. But all of that has to happen in order to, distill that down to exactly what the best practice is for you and how you should roll that tool out and how you should set it up. So buying something off the shelf and just thinking I'll install it and expect that it will just work, it just doesn't happen that way. We need the people, we need the years of experience and the people who are experts at their trade and experts in their roles to contribute to what that's going to look like, on the other end once it's rolled out and it's live.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And look, for me, it's really just supporting off the back of that is understanding the why, like why are you bringing the system in? Really building off that. That would be the starting point that I would always recommend.
I think so too. We think about often a quick fix might be to get a new system because the old system's got, too much stuff in it. It's been a dumping ground for data for so long and, teams have just put whatever they want in there. So we'll just get a new system. But without understanding the mistakes that you made in the first place, understanding the why, you're right. How can you get success just by putting something new in its place and then potentially repeating those same mistakes again? So I think hand in hand where you've got teams who are involved, teams who are on board with you, who are prepared to go through this change process with you, and you understand why you're doing it, I think the margin for error there is very low.
Yeah.
So let's wrap up this episode today. I just want to thank all our listeners for tuning in to listen to Ben and I have a chat about implementations and what can go wrong when we're thinking about change management and how we roll things out. So if this has resonated with you today, maybe your current setup needs a little bit of work, or maybe you face some of these challenges yourself, we'd love to have you tuning in for some of our other episodes too. We've got lots of information that we love to share. So if you wanted to head to moti.co/playbook, so that's moti.co/playbook, you can find more information and more episodes where we talk about all things implementations and CRMs. So thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next one.
That's it for another episode of the Moti Playbook. One shift, one system, one measurable improvement. All information shared in this podcast is general in nature. For tailored advice specific to your business, visit moti.co/playbook and book a momentum call with our team. See you next time.